So I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's program. My name's Dahlia Fisher. I'm the Director of External Relations for the Maltz Museum, and it's a privilege to be with you. Tonight, we're coming together for the first of a three-part series, Global Response to the Holocaust, with the one and only Irene Shaland. You know, this program is being recorded, and we are thrilled that we'll be able to share with all of you tonight, as well as into the future with posterity, because we're recording this story. In the new Global Response to the Holocaust series, which is what we're come together for, internationally published writer and educator Irene Shaland has invited us to embark on a journey through the painful past and often controversial present of 12 countries on 3 continents to understand how and why various nations around the world respond to the Holocaust remembrance. Excuse me. And this series kicks off tonight with the Ring of Fire, Austria, Germany, Hungary, and followed by November 11th. And then again, we'll come together in December to cover even more countries. So you can register for tonight, 2 or all 3 of these fascinating and free online discussions to learn how different parts of the world have responded differently to one of the most violent periods of recent human history. So we encourage you, if you've signed up for one, it doesn't automatically sign you up for all 3. So please make sure to register for the additional ones, which I will let you know are almost sold out. Tonight's program is also sold out. So let's talk about why. Who is Irene Shaland?
It's me.
She's the author of The Tao of Being Jewish and Other Stories. As an internationally published art and travel writer, Jewish historian, and educator, she is famous to us locally and celebrated not only here, but around the world. Irene's research, publications, and lectures are focused on the multiple issues illuminating the diaspora identity, the rich tapestry of global Jewish experiences, culture, and heritage. Irene also writes and presents on the global response to the Holocaust. She's a regular presenter at such organizations as the ADL, Hidden Child Foundation, NAHOS, Holocaust Resource Center of New Jersey, New York Center for Jewish History Research, and the Museum of Jewish Heritage of New York, including the Maltz Museum since 2014.
Right.
So before we get started and I turn it over to Irene, I'd like to just let everyone know the structure of tonight's program so that we can plan accordingly. Everyone can see each other. We're all together to create the warmest possible environment we can, but that also means that we ask you to stay muted. You've been automatically muted by the host. And we ask that you keep on mute until the end of the program. Irene will lecture for us, and you're invited to post questions and comments into the comment box. I'll be tracking any questions and collecting them as we go through the program. We'll spend some time at the end of her lecture with a Q&A, and I'll be asking questions that come up through the program, and Irene will have a chance to answer them with me asking. At the end of the night, which should wrap up hour 15, Irene and Alex have kindly offered to stay on for another 15 minutes or more so that you can have an open conversation when you're able to unmute yourselves and talk among friends and do a little networking and ask more open questions. But the formal program will have ended at that point. I just wanted to let everyone know about that process. If you have any questions, feel free to make notes in the comment section, and I'll get back to you as we go along. But until then, the floor is yours. Irene, thank you.
Thank you, Daria. Thank you, the Maltz Museum team. It's always a great pleasure for me to work for you, with you, and with your audience. And thank you, everyone, for deciding to spend this evening with us. You see, Alex and I have visited over 70 countries. And this 3-part series, like everything else I do, coming out of our many travels and many personal conversations with people. Our main talent, we're good friends. We keep in touch. We make friends with people all over the world. They share their stories with us, and we share these stories in turn with you. And why do we do that? Big question of why. To entertain, to teach, or to remember, to ensure that our histories never get lost. Italian writer and Auschwitz survivor Primo Levi said, without remembrance, there is no future. Alex, I somehow got stuck. Yeah, I'm on. I have my technical director on site. It's always helpful. I didn't have to travel anywhere for that story. It lives inside me, as many similar stories do, in many Jewish people's hearts and minds. These are our personal Holocaust narratives. Pain and loss, lives interrupted, generations unborn, and post-war silence and indifference. No monument stands over Babi Yar, a drop sheer as a crude gravestone. I'm afraid. Today, I'm as old in years as all the Jewish people. I grew up knowing this Yevtushenko's poem by heart. In this poem, he wanted to expose incomprehensible inhumanity of what the Nazis did in Babi Yar, place in Kiev where they murdered an entire Jewish community. My grandmother Sonia's family in Vileika was similarly murdered, along with the entire population of this small town in Poland. And on this slide, you can see Jewish cemetery and memorial in Vileika, provided to me by my dear friend and Israeli cousin, Hanok Ben Yami. He visited Vileika a few years ago, we share grandparents. He tried to find the graves, and it was not possible. Everything was looted. Enterprise in Vileika stood 2 gravestones for building materials, and broken caskets were of no use to them, so broken caskets are everywhere. The memorial was placed in 1980, financed by descendants of people from Vileika, from Israel, Argentina, America, what have you. See, when my grandmother, Sonia Svirsky, left Vileika to follow her scientist, politician, communist husband to the Soviet Ukraine, by that time in early 1920s, Vileika was in Poland. Sonia did not find out her Polish family's fate until well after the war. By that time, Vileika, annexed by the Red Army, became part of the Soviet Republic of Belarus. Neither Polish nor Soviet government ever acknowledged what atrocities were done to the European Jewry in general and to their own countrymen in particular. Until the breakup of the Soviet Union, it was never ever acknowledged. Even though the word Holocaust came into widespread usage at the end of the 1960s, it was not till Alex and I arrived in the US in 1982, we learned the phrase Hitler's final solution and heard the word Holocaust for the first time. You see, the communist governments had their specific methods how to control historic memory. So in Belarus, like everywhere in the Soviet Union, the government was against acknowledging any national sense of identity. And instead, just Soviet patriotic citizens were commemorated. In Poland, on contrary, national identity, to be precise, Polish, was of paramount importance because Stalin directed his satellite country to build a stable ethnic society. So even if we don't talk about anti-Semitism that goes through all layers of Polish societies, and of course nobody wanted their compatriots come back from the camps, even mentioning of Holocaust implied multicultural country, and it was against official ideology. The Soviets wanted to suppress final solution for the same reason they wanted to cover up their own atrocities taking place in the Soviet Union, like mass collaboration of population with the Nazis in occupied territories. And the same was happening in other countries that became Soviet bloc. And they also wanted to cover the atrocities they did themselves. Mass purges, concentration camps, everything Hitler learned so well from Stalin, and their own crimes like murdering over 20,000 Polish officers in Katyn forest. So in my family, Yevtushenska's poem always was an indictment of the Soviets' official refusal to acknowledge what really happened to the Jews. Here we are in Minsk, Belarus capital. These photographs were provided to me by the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And you are now witnessing dedication of the very first Holocaust memorial. And for many decades was the only one. It also was the first one and the only one for over 40 years that dared to proclaim that the memorial is dedicated to the Jewish victims of Nazism in Yiddish. Well, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, during Stalin's anti-Semitic campaign, he fought against cosmopolitanism, in quotes, both the poet who wrote this Yiddish poem and the sculptor who chiseled it in stone were sent to Gulag for their bourgeois and nationalistic tendencies. I believe that most probably the end of horror is in remembrance. As Elie Wiesel said, memory is a keyword which combines past and present, past and future. And the Central Europe became the epicenter of the systematic state-sponsored murder of 6 million European Jews. I'm convinced that there are a few key factors that determine the victim's destiny, and you see it on your screen. I listed it there: the history of the Jews in the region of the country, the degree of control exercised by the Nazis, and for this too, just compare what's going on in Poland or say in Denmark, that was exemplary country for the Nazis, and very important, the behavior of the locals. And that's where Austrians surprised even the Nazis. They took great delight in persecuting, humiliating, beating, and murdering their former colleagues and neighbors, the Jews. It seemed that almost overnight, the nation of Freud and Mahler became Hitler's villain executioners. And we will go to Austria to remember the past, see the present, and imagine the unimaginable. When I presented my Vienna story at the Maltz Museum a few years ago, after the presentation, I met an elderly gentleman, Holocaust survivor, who was from Austria. When he was a child, his family managed to get to Cleveland. And he shared with me two most popular after the war Austrian jokes. Austrians fooled the world to think that Beethoven was Austrian and Hitler was German, that's the one. Germans were better Nazis, but Austrians made better anti-Semites. And Vienna has many faces. It's Vienna, Vienna the Magnificent, the city of elegance and supreme sophistication, the great Viennese civilization. Vienna is basking in its Baroque splendor. And when you go to see these Baroque palaces of Habsburgs, it's jaw-dropping magnificence. Vienna is also the city of the arts, and I have to make a full disclosure that Alex and I are lifelong edicts of the Art Nouveau, the style that was emerging in Europe at the end of the 19th century. This style liberated art from the canvas and became lifestyle. Here on the top right row, you can see Otto Wagner's famous building, Medallion House. We went through all Wagner's buildings. On the left, on the top, you see the Secessionist building. Art Nouveau became Secessionist art in Austria, and this building contains world-famous Beethoven frieze by Klimt. And by the way, the building was financed by Karl Wittgenstein, Jewish financier, father of famous philosopher. He was a baptized Jew. Many were very as much assimilated. And the bottom row, you see beautiful woman, her photograph, and again, world famous portrait, the woman in gold. Remember the movie a couple of years ago? Adele Bloch-Bauer. She actually was the muse of Klimt, and her salons and many other art salons of Vienna became supporters for Viennese modernism. And Jewish contribution to the arts cannot be overstated. Vienna's, and for that matter, Berlin's, Austria and Germany, entry into modernism like Art Nouveau, Secession, was in many ways due to Jewish patrons and collectors, as well as Jewish artists. Interesting book was published 1924, and I think the movie was done after the book. It's called The City Without the Jews, written by non-Jewish Viennese journalist. He presented a biting satire against anti-Semitism and said that take Jews out of Vienna, all we will have a headless torso. See, Jews were the most prominent collectors of art and antiques in pre-war Europe. And Jews had this courage. They first had the courage to embrace this, what I would determine as spiritual and political revolutionary aspects of much of pre-war German and Austrian art. And if you think about it, most known prominent cases of restitution cases concerning the arts, they all evolve around works by Klimt, or Schiller, or Kitchener. So we cannot neglect the distinctly Jewish character of Viennese modernism and the great contribution of Viennese Jews into modern art. And it also was in Vienna, where after the Anschluss, after April of 1938, art became a witness to genocidal policy of the Nazis, because for the Nazis was incredibly important to show their power through their power over art. One of the first acts of the Germans were to descend to the houses of famous financiers and bankers and great collectors like Rothschild, Singelmann, the Hans, and strip their house of works of art. They were as passionate about collecting art as they were passionate about destroying the lives of their owners. Because it's not moving. Here we're in Vienna, which is a city now of the opera, Viennese Opera Theater. Can you go back? Okay, thank you. You see Gustav Mahler, he called himself the most famous Jew of Vienna. And he was lucky that he died 37 years before the Anschluss, because his works were determined by the Nazis to be too Jewish and degenerate. His music was banned. When Mahler was invited to become a general director of Viennese Opera, the only caveat was for him to convert to Catholicism, and he did. Even though he had strong Jewish identity, he thought of himself first as a musician, the artist, then as a Viennese, and only then as a Jew. So it did not matter. It didn't matter that he was converted for the Germans as well. They banned his music. Now let's enter Vienna, the city of the Jews. In a casually anti-Semitic book, as I would determine it, written by Jacob Wasserman, he stated that Vienna was a city where all public life was dominated by the Jews. The bank, the press, the theater, literature, social organizations. he was not so far off. 71% of bankers were Jewish, 65% of lawyers, 59% of doctors, and half of the journalists were Jewish, and a very high percentage of the musicians in Vienna were Jewish as well. And most of these Jews were highly assimilated. They had perfect facades. They disappeared into Vienna. They assimilated. And even though they kept up the appearances, for them to acknowledge that anti-Semitism existed was a bad taste. You should make fuss about it, but anti-Semitism was a fact of everyday life. Even in 1899, some representatives of Reichstag, Austrian parliament, called very passionately for bounty for the killed Jews. So let's go have fun. And you know who made the stand was an emperor, Franz Joseph, who said, I will tolerate no Jew hatred in my empire. Well, he was not very successful. Karl Lueger, who was passionate anti-Semite, 6th time was elected mayor of Vienna. He was leader and founder of the Christian Social Party and the model for Hitler for development of his racial theory. Karl Lueger stated multiple times, we object to the old Christian Austrian Empire being replaced by new Jewish empire. We do not hate anything but the oppressive big capital which is in the hands of the Jews. And after the war, Austria declared itself to be first victims of Nazism. And here you see again, it's a photo from Holocaust Museum, how Hitler addresses these cheering Viennese victims. 2 symbols of Vienna. What do they have in common? On the left, you have St. Stephen Cathedral, 12th century, and on the right, the king of the waltzes, this quintessential emblem of Viennese civilization, Johann Strauss. As soon as Nazis entered Vienna, one of their first acts was to go to the St. Stephen and destroy or change some records of birth and marriage. You see what happened, that Johann Strauss happened to have Jewish grandparents on both sides. The parents converted, but grandparents were Jewish, and Johann Strauss often wrote to his friends and cousins, I'm a Jew at heart. However, Strauss was one of the most favored, beloved composers of Adolf Hitler. Hitler adored the Blue Danube waltz, and he could not accept that by his racial theory, Strauss should be determined as a Jew. So can you imagine more outstanding example of violent anti-Semitism than going to Catholic Church and destroying the records? It tells something about it. Here, another photo from Holocaust Museum. You see happy victims, welcome new owners. And this photo became part of my mental landscape since 1993, when Holocaust Museum was open in Washington and I first saw it. Look at these people, happy, joking, laughing. They formed an unescapable ring. And I often think, who were they? Who became their children and grandchildren? I'm sure these people, or maybe their parents and or, who voted Karl Lueger 6th time to become mayor of Vienna. After the war, strange things happened. Austrians declared themselves innocent victims. Everybody bought it, including the United States, that provided money from Marshall Plan for rebuilding Austria. Only Churchill always knew a liar when he saw or heard one. So in the 1990s, mid-1990s, Austria began to acknowledge that they did take part in some persecution acts. They even rebuilt Innsbruck synagogue to show their goodwill. They reopened the Jewish Museum in 1995. And other memorials or acknowledgement began to appear. You know, the great Jewish community of Austria, almost 70% of them were able to escape. What happened that Austria indeed was the first step in Eichmann tuning, finalizing his final solution. So he didn't close the borders. And over 70% of the Jews were able to leave. In Vienna were over 200,000, 2 million Jews, and over 200,000, 10%, 1 in 10 of Viennese were Jewish. But 30% that stayed were rounded up, sent to Auschwitz or Theresienstadt and murdered. One famous Viennese citizen, Sigmund Freud, left. His 3 elderly sisters stayed and died in Theresienstadt. When you go on a Jewish heritage or Jewish history tour, very often you're brought to this monument against war and fascism. Nothing about the Jews here, almost nothing. 4 freestanding statues supposedly to be thought-provoking, but for us, it was totally lacking emotional impact. It's hard to decipher. You can see a man with a head and inside the stone. Could be Orpheus descending the underworld or somebody hiding from realities. There are gates, broken gates of violence, any violence, declaration of human rights. The only statue that talks about the Jews, probably, it's hunch over figure of an old man. When you hunch over, you can see he has a brush and probably scrubbing the pavement. What do you think the barbed wire is for? It's not meant to remind you of Auschwitz and other extermination camps. It meant to prevent you or your dog of using this statue at the bench or the toilet. I'm guessing. Okay. Next, you're often brought to the Jewish Museum in Vienna. It's next to the Mozart House. And it was the first museum of this kind in 1895. Of course, it was closed by the Nazis, reopened only in 1995. The museum focuses on the great contributions the Jews of Austria made into what's considered Viennese civilization, science, philosophy, medicine, the arts, and music. Only on the top floor, you can see objects scorched by fire during the Kristallnacht, because museum does not talk, does not show the end of this brilliant community. Jewish Museum has a partner nearby Jewish Plaza. You see, over 30 years ago, during construction, the remains of medieval synagogue were discovered. In Middle Ages, Viennese Jews, they were called the wise men of Vienna. They were very famous, very long community, and this community was murdered, exiled, burnt alive. The year was 1421, and Archduke of Vienna, Albert V, needed money. What could be the best way? Just get the money from the Jews. So those who did not leave hid in the synagogue, and they were burned alive. And as if I always saw it as an irony, the statue of Lessing, philosopher, outstanding representative of German Enlightenment, is right there. On the same plaza, there is a memorial that dedicated to the Jews murdered in the 20th century. It's on your right, and on the left you can see what's left of the synagogues the Jews murdered in the 15th century. This was the only, and still the only, memorial dedicated to the victims of Nazism, even though it does not say so. It's a reinforced concrete cube with doors closed, and it's supposed to be a library. You can, with bookshelves and the books, but book spines, they face inward, so you cannot read the book. I understand the symbolism. The library could not be used. There are no books to read because people of the book are dead. And again, it was not really full of emotional meaning for me. Nearby is a Staatstemple, the only synagogue in Vienna, for now, if you don't count Chabad House, and the only one that was not burnt in Kristallnacht. And you know why? The reason goes to 1781, year of 1781, when Emperor Joseph II, the same one who said to Mozart he had too many notes, remember in the Amadeus? So this emperor issued the Edict of Tolerance, where he admitted that yes, Jews like anyone else, any other religion, they could build their houses of worship and have their schools, with one tiny caveat: it shouldn't look like a synagogue, it should not be on the main street, and the entrance should not be going to the main street. So by the time of the Anschluss, it was a very prestigious region in Vienna. And the Nazis gutted everything inside, but left the building intact. Because if you burn it, everything else would go up in flames. But Nazis, key officials already lived in this little street. So the synagogue survived. To meet the murdered Jews of Vienna, you have to go across the river, leave these historical monuments behind, because Jews didn't live in the center, with the exception of Rothschilds or other bankers who built their palaces in Ringstrasse, that, by the way, was called Karl Lueger Ringstrasse forever. Only 2012 was renamed as University Strasse. Nobody uses University Strasse. It's like 6th Avenue and Avenue of the Americans. Who uses Avenue of the Americans in New York City? So you leave it all behind and you go to the second district. It's Leopoldstadt. There are no tourists there. Life's going on. But this is where you see stepping stones, the path of remembrance. It's bronze plaques, 3 inches and 3/4 squares. Often there are in 2s or blocks of 4, or with an explanation plaque. And one of them, it's read in German, to the memory of the Jews whose nobody remembers, but always, always these names. Because the murdered Jews of Vienna, almost 70,000 of them, have their names back. This Path of Remembrance was founded by Dr. Elizabeth Ben David Hindler, whom I corresponded with for years. She based her society on stones of remembrance, stepping stones in Europe. The project started by German artists. But here she tries to recreate not just the names, not just the houses, addresses from which Jews were deported and where they lived before they were murdered, but to recreate the vibrant life in Leopoldstadt. You see, this was the area, that was the region where Mahler lived, where Theodor Herzl lived. It was the center of Judaism and Hasidism, with numerous theaters and political clubs and publication houses. That was left of the largest Viennese synagogue, Leopoldstadt Temple. And you know, if you've been to the Plum Street Temple in Cincinnati or the Honey Street Synagogue, we'll go there. In Budapest, they're all modeled after Leopoldstadt. Of course, it was burnt to the ground. A strange thing happened to us. We're crossing very busy intersection, and we noticed 2 bronze plaques with 2 names, Bernard and Adele Sachs. We traced their son, Dr. Oscar Sachs. He was 85 years old, almost 10 years ago, living in Austin, Texas. And he explained why everybody's stepping on it, cars go over it. He said he was a child sent by Kindertransport to London. His parents stayed behind and perished in Auschwitz. The house where he was born, where they lived, no more. It's a small garden there. Across the street where you see this ugly building was the popular Eder Theater. And his parents been great theater lovers and even amateur actors. They were going to the theater from their house across the street a few times a week. So he thought it would be appropriate to put the bronze plaques with their names, where they crossed the street so many times and they were full of life and love and hopes for the future. So the society hope, as Dr. Ben David Hindler wrote to me, is to contribute to the healing of deep wounds. So that's, for me, was the best memorial to those who perished. What's going on in Austria today? And often in analyzing the situation today, I try to separate what the government does and what do people think. You know, ADL does annual study, ADL 100, when they go over 100 countries and ask the same questions. So for the latest study, over 50% of Austrians admitted that they have anti-Semitic feelings, because they agreed with statements like Jews talk too much about Holocaust, Jews are more loyal to Israel than to the countries they live in, the Jews have too much power. Now, you know, the series of anti-Semitic attacks, especially in the city of Graz, were published multiple times during this summer. Government is different now, with a new chancellor, very young, very ambitious, very liberal, and very forward-looking, Sebastian Kurz. He changed things around. First of all, right after lockdown, they broke the ground for the real Holocaust memorial dedicated to murdered women, men, old people, and children who were murdered during the Shoah, and it will be close to Ringstrasse. That's a huge step forward. He also speaks about the importance of Holocaust education and commitment to fighting anti-Semitism. See, this was a famous exhibit. It stayed in Vienna and Ringstrasse all through the spring. And there's photographs of non-Jewish artist photographer from Florence, Luigi Toscano, were used. He made it, it's a long one and goes many meters through the square, through the Ringstrasse, photographs of now surviving Holocaust victims. It was repeatedly vandalized. So the artist tweeted, Austria, what's wrong with you? The same time, Sebastian Kurz, who is considered by the editor of Austria's online Jewish publication, very important one, Kurz is one of the most pro-Israel leaders in Europe that Europe had ever seen. Under his leadership in September last year, Austrian parliament amended the Austrian Citizenship Act to enable descendants of Nazis victims to acquire Austrian citizenship. And the photograph is here shows Kurz meeting with Holocaust survivors or descendants of Holocaust survivors during his visit to Tel Aviv. And now let's go to Hungary. For me, Budapest always looked like sister to Vienna. It's different, at the same time very familiar, the same spirit of sophistication and great culture. And in Hungary, you encounter stories of beauty and stories of hatred. Budapest, just like Vienna, it's a city of opera and sophistication. And if the theater looks to you very familiar, it's almost a copy of the Viennese opera house. Like Vienna, Budapest, basking in artistic splendor, multiple theaters dedicated to music and operetta. And Art Nouveau is absolutely incredible here. We're inside of the Conservatory of Music. And just look at this light fixtures on the ceiling. It's incredibly beautiful. Well, when Elie Wiesel talked to Hungarian National Assembly in 2012, he said, wherever in the world I come and the word Hungary is mentioned, the next word is anti-Semitism. But, you know, it probably fell into deaf ears because Wiesel's home country never, ever, even today, acknowledges that Hungarians were the perpetrators, not just Nazis were bad guys. There are 2/3 of the population were rounded up and sent to death mostly by Hungarians. And here, just for you, in a nutshell, I wanted to see the timeline so we can put this long tradition of anti-Semitism into historical context. 1848-49, we have anti-Habsburg revolution in Hungary. 1867, creation of joint Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy. 1918-20, collapse of Austria-Hungary. Then World War I, alliance with Nazi Germany. After the end of it, communist takeover. 1956, a revolution that was crashed by Soviet tanks. By the way, those of you who are from Cleveland, we have the largest number of Hungarians who were running away from Russian tanks. And you know, the way Hungary deals with anti-Semitism is total rejection, where 4 different lies. That there was never anti-Semitism in Hungary before Nazi entered the country in 1944. It's lie number 1, even though it's a very long tradition of pogroms and mass murders. Lie number 2, Hungary did not implement any official anti-Semitic policies before German forces occupied the country. But Hungary was the first one to create anti-Semitic laws, the very first one in Europe and anywhere in the world in 1920 with Michael Milosz Thornton in power. Numerous clauses act which restricted severely the number of Jews admitted to higher education and to professional positions. Hungarian anti-Semitism was an organic, essentially Hungarian development well before the Nazi occupation. Oops.
Click.
Okay. Line number 4, that deportation, ghettoization and deportation was done by the Nazis. Nazis played a very minor role. Consider this, March 19th, 1944, Germans enter Hungary. Eichmann had a work plan goal to murder, to round up and deport 800,000 Jews for to murder them from 660 square kilometers territory. His staff was 20 officers, that's it. So this goal was impossible to meet without passionate devotion of Hungarian citizens helping the Nazis. On the pages of his Night, Weissel recalls the Hungarian police ordered how they were rounding up people to deport them. That was when I began to hate them. He's not writing about the Nazis, about Hungarians. They were the first oppressors. They were the first faces of hell and death. And Jewish quarter in Hungary, one of the most famous, most visited now in Europe, probably after Joseph district in Prague, and this beautiful Moorish revival style synagogue, Dachnani synagogue. It sits over 3,000 people. 2 others on the left, it's Budapest Art Nouveau, Kaczynski, and Rumbach synagogue, built by Art Nouveau architect from Vienna, Otto Wagner. So what's going on with Holocaust commemoration in Hungary? Again, the government, first, during Soviet domination, nobody could even mention the word. Then in the late 1970s, Soviets treated Hungary a bit more, permitted more freedoms than in Russia. But any Holocaust studies, related research was very restricted, very under strong ideological control. In the 90s, Hungary joined the Stockholm Declaration. They issued acts on compensation restitutions. However, the overarching motives always was and is now that all atrocities were committed by the journals. Holocaust Memorial Center was built in 2002, and it's outside of traditional Jewish quarter to show its national importance. And Budapest has quite a few very touching, very sensitive Jewish monuments like this Emmanuel tree with many of 30,000 names inscribed on tree leaves. Behind this tree, symbolic Raoul Wallenberg tombstone. We all know the role Raoul Wallenberg played in saving the Hungarian Jews, but very few remember Karl Lutz, who was Swiss diplomat and saved 60,000 Hungarian Jews. Oops. And of course, many of you, I'm sure, have seen this 60 pairs of rusted period shoes. Hundreds of Hungarian Jews were murdered here by the Arrow Cross militia. So what's in Hungary today? You know, the party in power is right party, very right-wing party called Fidesz. And its leader, Viktor Orban, he demonstrated that even now, even today, in the 21st century, one can achieve overwhelming victory by hate-mongering and blaming all problems, guess on who? The Jews. And today, he is at work finding an enemy within. The Treaty of Trianon became dangerous political anti-Semitic weapon. I'm sure most of you never heard about it. You know, Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. Treaty of Trianon, signed in Trianon Palace, ended Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it was Hungarian version of Versailles Treaty. And it was a trauma, because from 300,000 square kilometers, the country is reduced to less than 90,000 square kilometers. The population of almost 20 million became 7 million. Every family is affected. They wake up one morning and their members of their family or their relatives, friends are citizens of foreign countries. And it's always in trauma, one often, not always, tries to find who to blame. So the Jews were to blame 1920 for that, as they call it, catastrophe. June 4th this year, this past June, marked 100th anniversary of this Trianon Treaty. Look at Viktor Orban. That's what he's saying. We're fighting an enemy that is different from us. Not open, but hiding. Not straightforward, but crafty. Not honest, by base. Not national, but international. Does not believe in working, but speculates with money. Does not have its own homeland, but feels it owns the world. Yeah, who is he talking about? And the House of Faith, new Holocaust museum, cost 18 million to build, was finished in 2016. 18 million is a lot of money for Hungary. It's not open. And it's probably because of the conflict between uneasy Hungarian Jewish federations and the right-wing government, because they whitewashed the country's role in the Holocaust. And the new memorials, the one on the right, it's memorial to Miklos Horthy, who proudly admitted, for all my life I have been anti-Semite. He is responsible for hundreds of thousands of Jewish lives. But Orban says he's great hero in Hungarian history, in this memorial unveiled just a year ago. And coming to Germany, we face different situation, coping with the past. Unlike Austria and Hungary, Germany continues its journey of conscience into the painful past. So this coping with the past concept is a key foundation of the post-World War II German culture. See what happens. Holocaust commemoration memorial days that we have on June 27th every year. It started in Germany, not because of the government acts, but lay-led, public lay-led societies and individuals in 1995 decided to start dedicating this day to remembering the Holocaust. A year later, German government sanctioned the day as the official Holocaust National Day of Remembrance, and just in 10 years, United Nations decided to officially designate January 27th as the Memorial Day. So it did not happen overnight. Of course, during the Soviet domination, Germany maintained that Holocaust doesn't concern us. It all was from capitalistic Germany. All memorials you now see in Berlin, and believe me, there are dozens and dozens of them. There are more memorials in Berlin alone than an entire European Union combined. All these memorials began to appear after the unification of Germany and breakup of the Soviet Union. That was the very first memorial to the murdered Reichstag members. And that probably the most famous memorial to the Holocaust victims. It doesn't mention Holocaust. By the way, Holocaust is not mentioned into any of the memorials in Berlin. Memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. And if you ever had a chance to walk through it, it's a feeling almost surreal, uneasy, troubling experience of going through this strange, surrealistic necropolis that lost touch with human reason. And one of the, I think, heart-biting and heartbreaking memorials is the one that very few people visit, maybe because it's all in German and we needed help of the translator. It's called Places of Remembrance. It's in the center of the city in Bavarian Quarter that was home to German intellectuals such as Billy Wilder or Albert Einstein. And it became ghetto where many of Berlin Jews were rounded up, taken there before deportation and death. And these 80 placards, very bright, always with date, they chronologically show the laws, like Jews are no longer allowed to keep pets. Jewish employees can be fired without any notice. Aryan, non-Aryan children not allowed to play together. So regulation one after another, that systematically deprive Jews of their jobs, of their rights, and eventually of their lives. I wanted to show you a couple of other memorials. There are probably hundreds of them. The memorial, wall of names, wall of mirrors, wall of flame, even memorial to Jewish fashion industrialists. And this one probably very interesting for me as a former librarian, memorial right in front of the Humboldt University to the burning books. And every year when was the date, May 4th of 1933, when the books were burned, students hold their book sale to commemorate the events. You look through the glass, you see empty library. There's space enough, I was told, to 20,000 books, the number of books burned by the Germans. And now Germany began to document not only atrocities by the Nazis, like in the Topography of Terror Museum, but they also added now atrocities done by the Stasis. So it's interesting to walk through this trial of terror. This is the site of Hitler's bunker. I wish they just remove the sign and build something on it like cafe and night bar, because anytime we saw it, people wanted to take their photo near it. It should not be there from my point of view. The remaining section of the Berlin Wall, and of course, the world famous Jewish Museum of Berlin. Daniel Libeskind, this great architect of our time, who created architecture as a story, architecture as remembrance, he was contracted just to build the extension of the Berlin Historical Museum with an addition of pavilion about Jewish history. But Libeskind did not want to design a pavilion. He wanted to recount German Jewish history. So he designed the floor based on two lines. You have the building visible, the zigzag line, and invisible straight line. And the portion where the two lines intersect, you have the voids, empty spaces. So it's a broken Jewish story. And you can see the old 19th century building, and he placed the story of remembrance architecture as telling the story building next to it. Windows that you could see from outside. It's not just abstract lines. That's a Jewish geography. They reflect the streets where notable Jews lived and from which they were taken and deported to their deaths. And on the right, Alex's photo of the void, memory void, cuts through entire vertical axis. Then neither heated nor conditioned, and installation there, this one, faces punch out of steel sheets. It's called Fallen Leaves installation. The Garden of Exiles, you can see from outside, it's very strange. It's supposed to illustrate the experience of European Jewish exiles. You see willow branches towards the sky, and you feel, when you look at the sky, you feel the possibility of release. It's really very poignant to walk through it. And here I would like you to think answers to difficult questions. No other city in Germany, no other city in Europe has so many memorials. There's a couple of young historians from Israel who do 3 days tour just to visit most of the memorials to talk about what's behind them. So what do these memorials represent? And why so many in Berlin? Who are they meant for? They expressions of memory in contemporary Germany, and they honest representation of introvert internal process among the Germans. I believe so. But you can look at it from a different perspective. Why not a single memorial in any other city where we're thriving, brilliant communities that know more? So was not this done to maybe unconsciously to rebrand the image of Germany? Maybe the emergence of all these memorials in the 21st century is not coincidental, but connected to Berlin becoming one of the prime destinations in among European capitals on the level of Madrid or Rome or London. Maybe they meant for us, for tourists, for Jewish tourists to see. I don't know. There are no single answer for me on that. And Germany today, as you know, Angela Merkel just announced that Germany will donate $66 million to Auschwitz Museum, and government really considered fighting anti-Semitism as a permanent duty. And there is an independent panel on anti-Semitism, appointed federal commissioner on anti-Semitism. A lot is going on. In January of this year, foreign minister urged Germans to fight anti-Semitism because he believed the German community once again will disappear from Germany. The Jews would just pick up and leave like they do from France because of their continuous anti-Semitic attacks. Remember, just recently, we're talking about a year since attack on Yom Kippur and City Hall in Germany. And here on the right, you see Hamburg Temple that was attacked just, what, a week ago during the Sukkot. For the nation of 200,000 Jews, its new form of all hatred, are rising old fears. And Felix Klein, the German government commission on anti-Semitism, says that anti-Semitism is a deeply rooted problem in German society. And I wanted you to see the analysis of anti-Semitic attitude in just Berlin. I never look at it as so many categories: modern anti-Semitism, anti-Israeli Semitism, anti-Judaism, religious, just 8%. But the major one, anti-Semitic othering. You know what othering means? Fabrication of difference, us against them. And we conclude the painful journey coming back to our point of departure in the beginning of this presentation. Remember the monument in Minsk, this humble obelisk in the pit called Yama, where Minsk Ghetto, the largest ghetto in the occupied Soviet territory, 100,000 people were murdered. To this obelisk in the year 2000, sculptured group was added. And the photos, we have not been in Minsk ever, but our friend Alla Abrukin from New York did, and it's her photos. So for me, it's the best visual expression of many families' Holocaust narratives. There are 27 naked figures. You can distinguish musicians with musical instruments, women with children. No facial expression detailed, but the expression of horror. This obelisk repeatedly vandalized and restored. And I wanted just to write down my thoughts for you. I think there always will be those who bent on destruction and those who inspired to create. The reason I study Holocaust, not only because it concerns me directly, it's our own memories, but I want every family Holocaust narratives, if it's oral or written or cast in bronze, to be that creative force that preserves memories and builds bridges between the horrific past and the future in which these atrocities should not be repeated. May we always choose life. And at the end, I want to remind you that the fact that you registered for part 1 does not mean, as Dalia said, that you automatically registered for the parts. So if you're not entirely bored with me and you want to come again for other part of the world, please register for the second or third or both of them parts. And my book is, by the way, was available at the museum store, and you can read more stories about Jewish history and diaspora and about little known Jewish communities in my book. And it's available on Amazon as well, as an ebook or even a large print. And thank you for staying with me through the end. And I hope we'll meet again.
Thank you, Irene. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene.
Oh, Barb, thank you for coming.
I figured it out. Thanks a million. Thank you, Alex. God bless you. L'chaim.
So
Thank you,
we
Barb.
didn't have any specific questions. Oh, we've got one. Here comes one. We have one question for you at the moment, Irene. Why did Israel host Orban given his anti-Semitic attitude?
By who? I'm sorry, I did.
Orban?
Oh, Viktor Orban. For me, he's a devil incarnate. I think nothing, no dialogue is possible. When he was a young student, he was sponsored by Soros for studying abroad, but then he used his education for different purposes. He's an open anti-Semite. And I'm not sure what future holds for Hungary when they have this right-wing party in power. And there's a huge Jewish community in Hungary. I think it's over 100,000 Jews.
Still to this day?
Still to this day. And that's like, we're Jewish, like was in the Soviet Union, where we're Jewish, but we don't push it. Just don't tell anyone.
My mother was Hungarian, a Hungarian Jew in the
remember.
Holocaust. Yeah, she's a survivor. So it was interesting. I was particularly interested in that section. And I did have a question for you. Maybe some other folks want to, if there's anything anyone else wants to think about to ask. Irene, could you tell us about the difference between the main city of Budapest in Hungary and some of the smaller cities, and what the difference was from a timeline perspective? Like, for example, my mother was from Debrecen, Hungary, which is a small suburb of major cities. And what was the, what was the timeline from if the Nazis from Germany weren't the ones that were coming in and swooping everyone out, how did it sort of unravel? Because it was at the end of the war that they started getting taken down.
That was a complicated situation. After the Allies landed in Sicily, in Sardinia, in October 1943, Miloš Horthy realized that that might be the beginning of the end. And he better seeks separate peace agreement with the Soviet Union or Americans or the British, with allies. So he was not very, very active in rounding up the Jews in Budapest, but he was so in helping because he thought that wouldn't be uncovered, because Eichmann already was in the country with his huge staff of 20 officers. With Horthy's help and very active leadership, they rounded up to about, I think, 400,000 Jews in the places where your mother and your family from. All over Hungary, not in Budapest. Budapest was the last ones. But so it's considered the fastest murderous project in history, because they rounded up 450,000 Jews in a matter of 50 days to send them to concentration camps.
Wow.
And it was done by Horthy and his gangs, his army. And Budapest, of course, ghettoization and rounding up the Jews were done by Aerocross. You know, it's Hungarian fascist party. By the way, in early 1900s, Hungary formed their nationalist fascist party, and a party called Anti-Semitic Fascist Party. What's in there? You know, I think the name says a lot, but that was probably the major difference. 1 out of 10 Holocaust victims is Hungarian.
I didn't know that. Wow.
It's from Holocaust Museum data.
Thank you. We have another question for you. Some people say that Hitler was inspired by the American experience with indigenous people during its expansion westward. What do you think?
Yeah, I studied a lot the sources for Hitler's Jew hatred, including the what ifs, though my late mother always said that history does not like ifs, never happens. What if he would be accepted as an artist into Viennese Art Academy? And so he was not, and he hated everyone who was on his way, and he decided we're Jewish. But I think Hitler learned a lot from Stalin. The idea of concentration camps and mass purges and falsification of reality and history. Many years ago, when I still worked for NASA and often traveled to Moscow, there was, I think, in the mid-1990s, a huge exhibit in Moscow called Moscow Berlin. And they had side by side Stalin's policies and Hitler policies that followed faithfully in Stalin's steps. So I think Stalin's Soviet Union, Stalinistic Soviet Union, was the major source of very specific model how to implement what Hitler always wanted. Karl Lueger, he cited as his inspiration in his racial theory, again, the Jews. I never came across extermination of 12 million Native Americans on our continent.
Sure. It has been said that he was inspired, so to speak, by other genocides, the Armenian genocide, for
but
example.
He probably wanted to speed up the solution, the final solution. The extermination of Indians took a long time. For him, he wanted everything done immediately, get rid of the Jews.
Yep, there is some research, if I'm not mistaken, Irene, maybe you can speak to it, not that I've read specifically about the indigenous people, but about the relationship to people of color in the United States and the treatment of people of color.
By the Nazis?
Right, there was, I've heard that loosely throughout. I mean, I can't cite a specific source. It's one of the things that's been tossed around and heard. I mean, is there any substantiation to that?
And, you know, for me, anti-Semitism and racism is the same sides of the same coin. And I wanted to quote very loosely of Lord Jonathan Sacks, who was chief rabbi of the United Kingdom until recently and was knighted. And he's a wonderful philosopher and writer about anti-Semitism. And he said that anti-Semitism or racism, for that matter, is simply the inability and unwillingness of major group to make a room, to make a space for difference. And because we're so different, the hatred that starts with the Jews will never end with the Jews. So we all have to be fighting it together. And I think for Hitler, anybody who is different, mentally from Aryan race, so African people or homosexual or mentally challenged or physically challenged people, they all have to be removed from the face of the earth.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, this comes at an incredibly timely event for the museum. Today, we announced a new collaboration called Stop the Hate Ohio that is the joint effort of the Maltz Museum and Cincinnati's Holocaust and Humanities Center for a statewide Holocaust education campaign in response to the recent claims conference study.
Right, yes, yes.
But it also coordinates coincidentally with the launch of this event. So while I encourage everyone to stay on and openly talk with Irene and Alex about their travels, their trips, and ask questions unmuted and have at it in good old-fashioned Zoom networking style, I will leave you from the Maltz Museum perspective with this thought that this is only the beginning of Irene's program. We have 2 more to follow. Please sign up for more fascinating conversations. And in addition, please look at our Stop the Hate Ohio site for information about Cincinnati's partnership. And our website has all of the programs to expand our Holocaust education offerings jointly with HHC, which includes weekly Holocaust survivor speaker series. So we hope that everyone will join us for that, along with the documentary film series and much, much more, all focused on this specific topic so we can more fully become present and aware.
Dale, and I have not question, but just, picking up on this terrific collaboration that I know it's probably was 99, if not 100% the product of your work. And, the speeding up, bringing to a new level Holocaust education. Because for me, education is the answer. But what do we have to do differently? The studies that you mentioned, I even printed it. It's a study, the Claims Conference, full name, the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. They did the first of this kind study, talking to 200 people in each of the 50 states. And it's a shocking discovery. Over 40% do not know about the Holocaust or think that Holocaust caused by the Jews, could not name a single extermination camp or how many people were killed. So what do we do wrong in the states that have mandated Holocaust education, where the wars, New York, New Jersey, California?
Right.
So what do we have to do differently in schools?
Right.
Because we have to catch them in the cradle,
So our response, our conversation is that at this point where we understand that young people are more likely to learn about the Holocaust through social media and come to their Twitter feeds, their Instagram feeds, their TikTok feeds without an understanding or knowledge based on the report, but they will see anti-Semitic rhetoric online before they have any knowledge about the Holocaust itself. So they're coming with no information and being fed misinformation, which is a dangerous territory, not just for us as a Jewish people, but as you mentioned, where there's hate for one group, there's hate for other groups, and it's a tipping point. So we wanted to do our part proactively, forge a collaboration statewide with Cincinnati's Jewish Museum and join forces to reach more of a broad audience and do more together than we can independently. And the reason that is because it's not only students we have to reach, because we know young people who are talking about, like,
Yeah.
as we get older, we think of them as younger and younger, but really these are fully formed adults, 18 to 26, that they were interviewing. So we now need to be seeing these adults coming into museums or being educated on their own through programming, and how we reach them becomes a challenge, because they really are the future of our country. And we want to make sure that, you know, they understand not only our history, but also empathy.
Thank you.
So on that note.
Okay. Thank you for having me.